Hey everybody, it's Spencer Blackman here from the Clinical Learning Team. And it's Friday. I thought, why not make another video? Actually, we've been seeing a lot of questions coming through around antibody testing. It's been a couple weeks since antibody testing arrived, which is ages in COVID time. So there was a couple questions I thought maybe we could dive into again and get a little deeper so we can kind of help clear up some questions that we have and questions that our patients have around the stage that we're in currently with antibody testing. I want to talk about how reliable is an antibody test result. And as you know, we're only ordering IgG. And when to order a PCR plus antibody test together. You probably saw the announcement today that we are starting to roll out combined testing in lots of our sites. And so when do we do this? So I want to talk about those kinds of things. Now, to talk about the first question, how reliable is a test result? I am going to do everything I can to avoid math, but there's going to be numbers in here. And I just have to say, I think that kind of going under the hood with how our tests work and understanding them, I think is really important. I think this is stuff that comes up in other parts of medicine. I think about screening tests that we do and other diagnostic tests that we do, and no test is perfect. And so understanding kind of what the limitations are and how to talk about those limitations and help patients make decisions is really valuable. So the first way to think about how a reliable test result is to ask how close to perfect is the test performance. If we had a perfect test, we would have 100% reliability of every test result. Now, because we don't have typically perfect tests, we don't have that. So we're going to look at how close to perfect, and then how common or rare is the condition in a community or population. And another sort of related question is just what's the pre-test probability? How likely is this condition in this person here? So let's dive into how close to perfect is the test. And this is where we're going to get into sensitivity and specificity. So one way that I like to think about sensitivity is how good is the test at identifying everyone who has the condition, right? If I'm going to test a population, a high sensitivity test, I will feel confident that I have not missed anybody that has the condition. All right, so let's look at a population here where we've got people with the light blue circles don't have the condition and people with the dark blue circles do. And you can think of a number of conditions like this. It's not totally rare, but not highly common either. And a test that had very high sensitivity would identify everybody who has the condition. So here you're seeing a test with 100% sensitivity because everybody who has the condition was identified by a positive test. And in reality, sometimes tests do actually have false positives where they identify somebody who doesn't have the condition as saying that it does. But this case, as you're looking at it here, still is 100% sensitivity because everybody who's a dark blue has a positive test associated with them. So let's look at specificity. How good is a test at identifying everyone who doesn't have the condition? So very similarly, we'll look at a population. And here we're seeing same population, but in this case, now we've identified everybody who doesn't have the condition has a negative test. There's nobody who is a light blue circle who doesn't have the condition who didn't get identified properly with a negative test. And similarly here, you might have a couple people who actually have it identified as not having it. Those would be your false negatives and would reflect less than 100% sensitivity. But again, we're still looking at a test here with 100% specificity. All right, and it's okay to go back and just watch those two slides again and let it sink in. Sometimes it takes a few times to just, really kind of appreciate what this is all about. But I think once you do, it's really valuable and helpful. Okay, so now our second factor in what makes a test reliable is how common or rare is the condition in a community or population. This is otherwise known as prevalence. And you can also think about it as pre-test probability. If you're just thinking about an individual, how likely is it that this person has the condition? That's the same concept. So here, now we're looking at a population where nobody has it, right? All those dark blue circles are gone. And so what this is showing is that in a population where the prevalence is extremely low, in this case 0, to prove an example, um, your negative tests are all accurate and your positive tests are all false. Negative tests are all true negatives, positive tests are all false positives. So of course we don't really have situations like this, but the point is that when your prevalence is extremely, extremely low, the test has to be better and better to make sure that it's not giving you false positives. Conversely, when you have a condition where everybody has it, um, your positive tests are all going to be true positives and your negative tests are all going to be false negatives. So in an extremely high prevalence, and in this case 100% condition, your positives are going to always be correct and your negatives are going to have a very, very, very good test. Otherwise, more and more of your negatives are going to be considered false or likely to be false. And we're going to look at how that works more in depth. So let's put it all together. So when you combine sensitivity, specificity, and prevalence, now you can get your reliability values. Positive predictive value, or PPV. This is the likelihood of a positive test being correct. So if you have an individual and the positive predictive value is 98%, then there's a 98% chance that their test is accurate. Or you could say of 100 positive tests, how many of them reflect true positives? Again, 98%, you'd be talking about 98 true positives and 2 false positives. Same with negative predictive value. If you have a negative result, how likely is that result to be accurate? Or if you had 100 negative results, how many of those negative results are true negatives versus false negatives? So if you had a negative predictive value of 90%, that means that 90 out of 100 would be true negatives and 10 out of 100 would be false negatives. Or you could also say in an individual, there's a 90% likelihood that this test is accurate. So that's pretty much it. When you combine sensitivity and specificity, which is the performance, how close to perfect the test is, and then the prevalence, how common the condition is or how likely it is that somebody has the condition, that's how you can get a sense of how reliable your test result is. So let's look at some real life examples. And I bring these up because these are the tests that you may have heard about. Patients are certainly asking about them, which is interesting. And I kind of understand why, because you start to learn when you dive into this that these tests are really good, but there are some subtle differences. And then there are tests that aren't as good. And so knowing which test was done can be helpful. Now, these are the tests that LabCorp and Quest are running. We've reached out to the reps. It's the best information we can get as of today. This does change. They don't really know exactly. They can tell us, well, this location is doing this test, this location is doing that test. They just know that these are the ones that they're using. They don't want to use just one test because they won't want to risk any supply chain issues. Like if some reagents run out for one test, then they'd be in trouble. So they're trying to get a combination of tests that reflect the best tests available. But these are really good tests. These assays are all assays that have already been used for a long time. These are like our fourth generation HIV tests and our antibody immune tests, any kind of serologic testing. These are very common and very good testing methods. They're just being now applied to coronavirus. Just to show you some data, here's an example of what LabCorp was sharing a few weeks ago. The data are even better now for the Abbott test, but 100% sensitivity and 99.6 specificity. There are data now showing 99.9 specificity for the Abbott test. The Roche and Diasorin tests are also reporting good accuracy, 99.8 or better specificity and 100% sensitivity for Roche, and the Diasorin is 99.3 specificity, so not as good, but the sensitivity is still very good. So if you look at the results as they come back, sometimes you'll see which test was done, and that might give you a little bit of insight. But the overall takeaway here is that the tests are getting better and better. LabCorp and Quest, which is who we're using for our tests, are only using the best tests that they can get, and they have very good sensitivity and very good specificity. So now we'll look at what does this actually mean in real life. So again, don't count all the numbers themselves. I just tried to make a decent looking reflection of the population. And so in New York, there's a reasonable number of people who likely have had the condition. And if we're talking about an antibody test, there are some reports of 1 in 5, so 20% prevalence. And so if you take a test like we have, you're going to see that all of the negative tests are going to be true negatives. There's nobody who's going to get a false negative. But there are a few people who are going to get false positives. In this case, it's really just one out of many, and I'll show you why that's the case. So most of the positive tests here are actually true positives. So you can really rely on a true positive test in this situation. We will look at the numbers now. So if you take the prevalence of 20%, and here's where the math comes in, bear with me, but it is helpful, I think, to see. And I'm using the diasorin test just to show kind of the worst possible scenario with a 99.3% specificity. But remember, the other two tests are 99.8, 99.9, so even better. You have a positive predictive value of 94.9%. So as we said, that means that the likelihood of a patient who has a positive IgG test of having that be a true positive is 94.9%. So very, very likely. A negative test is 99.8% likely to be an accurate negative test. So these numbers suggest that if you're in somewhere like New York and you've got a pretty high prevalence, you have a great test, at least as far as interpreting the test. You can rely on that result. Now, what that result means, does it mean that they have immunity? Does it mean that they have immunity forever? Can they get contagious? Can they get sick again? We don't know the answers to all these questions, but you can rely on the result. You know that they actually do or don't have antibodies based on the result. Now let's compare that to San Francisco, where for reasons not totally understood, the prevalence has been much, much lower than New York, even with a very high population density. And so again, don't count the numbers here. The prevalence is actually around 1% expected to be, thought to be in San Francisco. But what I'm showing here is that there are fewer positive tests and the proportion of false positives is a little bit higher. So when you have a very, very low prevalence, as we looked at before, you have more of a chance of a false positive. And so the better that the test is, specifically the specificity of the test, the lower the false positives are going to be. So let's look now at the numbers for San Francisco. And again, we're going to take the diasorin test first. 1% prevalence, these numbers, your positive predictive value is now 59.2%. So that shows you how the prevalence really plays a very important role in the positive predictive value. Now, this is still not useless information. I think a 59% might be valuable to a patient to know that, well, there's a 6 in 10 chance that they do have antibodies. That might be valuable for them. And the sort of flip side to that is that because the condition is low prevalence, a negative test is virtually certain. So 100% negative predictive value. So for somebody who finds out that they don't have antibodies, this could also be really valuable. This might help them, even if, especially in a case, I think about somebody who maybe had symptoms and they're thinking, yeah, I probably had it. And then they get antibody tests and it's negative. They didn't have it or they didn't mount an immune response. And so they are still vulnerable. So they may be more cautious and that's actually helping them learn about how to protect themselves and others better. So there is some value even in a low prevalence. But if we think about the Abbott and Roche tests, which are becoming more and more common at LabCorp and Quest, same situation, but now the specificity is 99.9. Your positive predictive value goes up to 90.1%. So now we just saw how the specificity really impacts the positive predictive value. And so you can become pretty sure that a positive antibody test is positive. And again, same thing though, whether it's 60 or 90, that's something that the patient has to interpret. They have to decide, do they feel comfortable with whether it's the 10% possibility that it isn't, or the 40% possibility that it isn't a true positive. They have to really process that, and we can help them do that and make decisions that are valuable. Again, negative predicted value is still 100% because the sensitivity is so good and the prevalence is so low. All right, so last point I wanted to make is if you have somebody who's had classic symptoms in a place like San Francisco where it's low prevalence, they're not going to be at that 1% prevalence anymore because you're now looking at a subset of people who have had symptoms, and still the vast majority of them will not have had it. But I'm just saying, let's imagine it's now from 1% to 5%. So it's now 1 in 20 people who had classic symptoms. So still 95% of people don't have it, still pretty low prevalence. But even if you take the diasorin test in that situation, you get a positive predictive value now up to 78.3%. And again, remember, it's going to be well over 90 if you were doing a Roche or a Abbott test. So the point here, and again, negative predictive value is still 100. The point here is that if you're talking about somebody who had symptoms, it's even more likely to be accurate on the positive side because you're now talking about a subset of people who have a higher prevalence. So keep that in mind in the situations where you're talking with patients. Really try and think about what is their pre-test probability, what is the likelihood that they have had it and that the antibody test will be accurate. And then when you get the test result, you can think about well, how likely is it now, your post-test probability. And again, I'm not asking anybody to calculate this out. There are places that you can. Armed with this information, you can help patients interpret that information. You know, they want us to give them absolute answers, and we can't. I mean, there's just uncertainty, as we all know. But I also think that giving them no insight and saying like, look, we don't know anything. We don't know if the tests are good. We don't know if the antibodies are protective. That kind of leaves them without the kind of guidance that they're looking for from us. And I think with this kind of information, we can give them a more nuanced answer. We can say, look, you know, there's a decent chance that your positive result is actually accurate. So I think it's very possible that you have antibodies. And we don't know yet if antibodies do provide immunity or protection. We don't know if they do, for how long, but a lot of experts think that they do because we're seeing that convalescent serum may be helpful. We haven't seen a lot of people who have recovered getting reinfected. So we don't have the definitive proof, but there are signs pointing that direction. And again, that might help somebody make a decision that they have to make. That's a hard decision. So here are my takeaways. So how reliable is the test result? The tests that we send to LabCorp and Quest have a very good sensitivity and specificity. We're not talking about the in-office tests. We will have good ones of those as well, but the tests that we're sending off now are good tests. A negative test is a negative test, no question. And then a positive test, you have to kind of think a little further about what's the prevalence, which test am I getting? And again, I think even the diasorin might get phased out. We'll just be seeing the Abbott and the Roche and the 99.9 specificity test. But in most cases, we're still talking about pretty good positive predictive values in the 75 to 95% range. So again, you can talk about that with your patients, and you don't have to quote even exact numbers, but you can tell them, there's a good chance that your test is accurate, and then you can help them make that decision. So this is what I was alluding to earlier, this question about what about visiting my blank, my older vulnerable relative or immunocompromised relative or friend, et cetera. Again, negative tests provide certainty. We can say that a negative test means you have not mounted an immune response, you don't have antibodies. Positive tests can provide useful information, but we can't give them certainty for multiple reasons. Primarily, the test may or may not be always positive. Although when you get in a higher prevalence place or you have the higher sensitivity and specificity tests, we can be pretty confident that a positive test is accurate. And then also, we still don't know for sure that these antibody tests do signal protection and immunity. As I said, I think we're starting to see evidence pointing in that direction. I've heard multiple, literally world experts in virology and immunology saying basically, yeah, they think that we do have immunity once we've recovered. That immunity may last a year or two. Similar to other coronaviruses, it will probably go away. So again, if we're looking for certainty, we can't, but we can partner with the patient. We can tell them what we know, what we don't know, and help them think through some of these challenging decisions that they're facing. So let's talk about the last question real fast. When should I order both a PCR and antibody test? You probably saw the announcement that we're starting to roll this out across all our offices. I can tell you, I don't know, but here are my thoughts. Certainly, we're going to see return to work requirements where employers are going to ask for both. Hey, we'll do it. Patients may just want to know. And again, I think with the right understanding, the right information, it's great. They want to know. Great. They want to get both tests. Maybe that's fine. There may be times where you should counsel them that they don't need a test. Like for example, if their symptoms were 8 weeks ago and they're feeling totally better, they shouldn't get a PCR. There's no question. Or if they're been sick for 3 days, they shouldn't get an antibody test. I mean, those are clear situations. But there's probably a window, especially in the 3 to 4 week post-symptom onset, where it might make sense to actually get both tests. And the reason I say that is because you guys have probably seen this already. This was recently published, nice, colorful, really nice graphic. And I think the data are pretty good behind this, that you can see kind of around week 3, week 4, the PCR positive likelihood starts to go down, the antibody detection starts to go up. And so in that period, you might get a negative PCR and a positive antibody, or a positive PCR and a negative antibody, and having both tests might be helpful to let somebody know, hey, do I have coronavirus? Did I have coronavirus? So there may be situations where getting both makes sense clinically. And we're going to learn more as the tests get better and better, as these kinds of curves become clearer and clearer, as we start to understand, do people who have asymptomatic infections make the same kind of antibodies as people who have more severe infections, et cetera. So that's it for me. I really appreciate you sticking with us to the end. As I said, I think understanding kind of what goes on underneath the hood with a lot of the tests that we do, the sensitivity, specificity, and prevalence, how those give us our test reliability, is really helpful. It will serve you in lots of different situations when coronavirus has sort of moved away from the forefront. And I also wanted to say, if you have any questions about this stuff, please reach out to me. have all the answers, but it's really great to dialogue. It's great to hear other perspectives. And I think we all get better when we can learn from each other. So please keep the dialogues coming. I love what I'm seeing in the Slack rooms, et cetera. And I hope that you guys are all doing well and have a great weekend.